I asked my wife, Clara, to donate a kidney to my mother. "Prove your loyalty to this family," I had said, in a solemn, heartfelt tone that now makes bile rise in my throat. And she had agreed. She, with her wide-open heart and naive faith in our love, had agreed to give away a part of her own body. 4 days after the surgery, I walked into her hospital room. But I didn't go alone. Beside me was Isabella, arrogant in a silk dress the color of wine, the color of betrayal. And behind us, a nurse pushed my mother, Eleanor, in a wheelchair, her face etched with a cruel, triumphant smirk. I still remember the feel of the manila envelope in my hand, heavy with lies and cold calculation. I tossed it onto Clara's chest. Inside were divorce papers. At that moment, I was ignorant of one crucial fact. I didn't know that this act wasn't just the end of our marriage, but the starting pistol for my own downfall. And I certainly didn't know that the kidney I had so ruthlessly stolen from her had never reached my mother. Before I recount the entirety of my fall, let me say this is not an excuse. It is a confession, an accounting of the rot in a soul that once had everything and chose to throw it away for pride and selfishness. I hope that in the ashes of this story, someone might find a warning. My story with Clara didn't begin with love. It began with a calculation. My mother, Ethan Vance, the woman of iron will who had built our family's textile empire, had received a death sentence. Chronic renal failure. The doctors said she had months, maybe weeks. The transplant list was years long, and we didn't have time. Desperate, I began a search. Not for a miracle. Orphaned at 9 after a catastrophic highway accident near Atlanta. Raised in the state foster care system, with no family, no one to lean on, no one who would ask questions if she suddenly disappeared. She was a perfect ghost, a person whose existence was defined only by herself. For my plan, she was the perfect prey. I found her working in a high-end fashion boutique in Buckhead, a place she clearly didn't belong. She had a quiet beauty, a stillness that radiated from eyes that seemed to have seen too much sorrow. She wasn't like the other women I knew, who were always trying to impress or gain an advantage. She simply existed, with a quiet dignity that made me, for a fleeting moment, feel ashamed of my intentions. But then I saw my mother in my mind's eye, pale and frail, tethered to a dialysis machine, and any hesitation vanished. I approached her under the guise of a customer looking for a birthday gift for his mother. I spent an hour there, not to select a silk scarf, but to study her. I watched the way she spoke, the way she moved, the way she maintained a polite yet warm distance. I saw the hunger in her eyes, not for money, but for connection, for belonging. And I knew I had found her weakness. "Do you always speak to customers with such calm?" I asked, handing her my black, no-limit credit card. "How else should I speak?" she replied. A simple question that exposed the chasm between our two worlds. I went back the next day, and the day after that. I invented reasons, questions about non-existent inventory, just for the chance to be near her, to weave my web. I invited her to dinner at a restaurant she had only ever seen in magazines. I watched her look of confusion at a menu with no prices, and instead of feeling pity, I felt the satisfaction of a hunter cornering his prey. That night, I took her hand across the table. "Are you really all alone?" I asked, my voice dripping with false sympathy. "Yes, no family left." "Not a soul," she said, her voice holding a fragility that made me almost believe my own performance. "We can change that," I whispered. And in her tear-filled eyes, I didn't see a woman. I saw a solution. I saw my mother's kidney. I saw the future of the Vance fortune secured. And I, Ethan Vance, the sole heir, was prepared to do anything to protect it. Even if it meant building a future on a lie, and destroying an innocent soul in the process. At the time, I thought it was an acceptable price. I was devastatingly wrong. We were married 6 months later, not in a church filled with white lilies or before friends and family, but in a cold, suburban courthouse. I explained it was my mother's wish, that she didn't want to waste money on a flamboyant event. A blatant lie. The truth was, we needed to keep things quiet. A grand wedding would have attracted attention, questions, prying eyes. Our plan needed darkness to germinate, and Clara's isolation was the most fertile ground. I knew she secretly dreamed of a white dress, of a wedding album to one day show our children. Sometimes, I'd catch her flipping through bridal magazines with a wistful look, and instead of guilt, I felt only a flicker of annoyance, as if her dreams were a minor inconvenience to my grand design. Now, that image comes back to burn my mind. I robbed her not only of a kidney, but of the simplest of dreams. What mattered most to her then was that she finally had a family, a home, a man who promised to be by her side forever. I was the hero in her story, but I was the monster lurking in plain sight. Even when my mother, Eleanor, looked at her with unconcealed contempt, I did nothing. I stood by as my mother constantly reminded Clara of her unfortunate past, of her being nothing more than an orphan. Each of my mother's harsh words was like a chisel chipping away at Clara's confidence. But it strengthened my position. It made her cling to me more, believe even more fiercely that I was the only person in the world who truly loved her. I turned our sprawling home in Alpharetta into a gilded cage where she felt like an unwelcome guest, afraid to even open the refrigerator without permission. I told myself this cruelty was necessary. I condoned my mother's malice because it served my purpose. For 2 years, Clara tried her best. God, did she try. She poured her soul into every detail to win an ounce of affection from the woman she called Mother. She cooked lavish dinners from complex recipes, dishes Eleanor would taste with a single bite before pushing the plate away with a grimace. She bought my mother gifts, perfumes, jewelry, expensive scarves that would then disappear into the vastness of her closet, never to be seen again. She smiled, a strained and painful smile, when my mother called her the family's charity case in front of guests. And I just stood there, playing the part of a loving but helpless husband, when in reality, I was the chief architect of her pain. I watched her wither in that hopeless effort, and I called it patience. What a monster I was. Then, Eleanor fell ill. The doctor's diagnosis was a death sentence, and the clock started ticking. It was then that our plan entered its final phase. I initiated the conversation in a hospital corridor while my mother lay behind a glass wall, her body connected to the tubes of a dialysis machine. The setting was the perfect stage for my theatrics. I dropped to my knees before Clara, right there on the cold linoleum, and took her hands, a gesture I'd copied from cheap romance movies. I know what I'm about to ask is unforgivable. My voice trembled, a well-rehearsed performance. I know it's too much, but you're the only one who can save her, the only one in the world. I could see the confusion and fear in her eyes. I had your records checked, Clara. Remember that physical 6 months ago? I had the doctors run a compatibility test, just in case. You're a perfect match. A 1 in a million chance, and it's you. She stood there in silence, trying to process my words. Donating a kidney, a piece of her body. I could see the internal struggle on her face. What about you? She finally asked, her voice hoarse. You're her son, her blood. Why not you? It was the question I was waiting for. I pulled a folded paper from my jacket pocket. It was a forged medical report I had paid a small fortune for, complete with official-looking stamps and signatures. Incompatible. I was the first one tested, the moment she was diagnosed. Do you think I would ask this of you if I could do it myself? Do you think I wouldn't give her both of my kidneys if it were possible? She stared at the text, at the incomprehensible acronyms and medical jargon that meant nothing to her. And she believed me. She believed me because she wanted to believe me, because she didn't know how to exist any other way. Her entire life had been built on the hope that people were fundamentally good, that I would never ask such a monstrous thing of her if there were any other option, that I loved her. For the next 3 days, I didn't give her a moment to breathe. I gave her no time to think, no chance to speak with anyone else. It was a full-scale psychological assault. I brought her coffee in bed, stroked her hair, said all the right words in the perfect tone. I held her so tightly she forgot to be afraid. "You'll truly become part of the family," I whispered into the darkness of our bedroom. "Not just a name on a marriage certificate, but blood and bone. My mother will love you like her own daughter. I swear it." I promised her a trip to Bora Bora, just the two of us, after it was all over. I painted a picture of a future I knew would never exist. I described Eleanor's grateful smile, her warm embrace, the words of thanks that Clara so desperately craved. And the fear of the scalpel receded, replaced by the burning desire to finally belong. This was her chance to prove her worth, not with words, but with the ultimate sacrifice. "Okay," she said on the third day, her voice distant, as if it weren't her own. "I'll do it." I pulled her close, burying my face in her hair to hide the triumphant smile that flashed across my lips. The smile of a demon who had just successfully coaxed an angel into hell. In that moment, I thought I had won. I had no idea that I wasn't just sealing her fate. I was digging my own grave. The day before the surgery, the hospital air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and suppressed anxiety. I led Clara to the office of the chief of medicine, a stern-looking man we had greased to ensure everything went smoothly. On his desk was a towering stack of paperwork: consent forms, liability waivers, procedural outlines, each with its own number and seal. I watched Clara, her head aching from lack of sleep, the words blurring before her eyes. She just wanted it to be over. While she was signing, I pointed to a specific clause, a small paragraph intentionally buried in a morass of legal jargon. "One more here, honey," I said, my voice casual, as if it were a mere formality. "It's just a standard contingency clause. All hospitals require it." It dealt with the potential use of the organ for another patient in the event the primary recipient was deemed medically ineligible at the last minute. I explained it was just to ensure her precious kidney didn't go to waste. A lie wrapped in logic. The truth was, it was our Plan B, a trump card designed by Isabella. Isabella Thorne, my long-time mistress, the woman my family had always deemed suitable. She was in London when my mother was diagnosed, but she had orchestrated things from afar. It was she who had suggested we needed an escape route, a way to control the situation even if something went wrong. That clause was an instrument born of cynicism and calculation, ensuring that no matter what happened, we held the winning hand. Clara, exhausted and wanting only to see warmth in my mother's eyes, signed it without truly understanding its implications. To her, it was just a line of ink. To me, it was the final act of betrayal, the last seal on our perfect plan. I watched her sign away her own destruction, and I felt nothing but the cold relief that everything was going according to plan. Oh, the blinding arrogance of me. That very signature, which I believed was my weapon, would ultimately become the dagger in my own heart. The next morning, as they wheeled Clara down the hall on a gurney, the overhead lights merged into a long, white streak, pulsing with the rhythm of her heart. I walked beside her, holding her hand, playing the devoted husband to the very last second. "I'll be waiting for you," I said, just outside the operating room doors, leaning down to kiss her. The moment you wake up, I'll be there. My face will be the first thing you see. And then, it's Bora Bora. Bora Bora, she whispered, a weak smile on her lips. She wanted to say something important I could see in her eyes, but the nurse was already pushing the gurney away. The last thing I remember before the doors swung shut was her face. A face full of trust and love. A face I knew I was about to shatter. At the time, I told myself it was a necessary sacrifice for the family. Now, in the solitude of this prison cell, I recognize it as an act of pure cowardice. I wasn't there when she woke up. I broke my promise. That promise, like my love, was merely a tool. 4 days. I left her alone for 4 days of pain and confusion. 4 days for the harsh truth to infect her incision. I'd arranged for her to be moved from the private recovery suite I'd promised to a shared ward in a different wing of the hospital. It was part of the plan, to strip her of all comfort, all dignity, to make her feel small and helpless when we delivered the final blow. I had imagined the scene 100 times, her lying there, weak, in pain, and us walking in, the gods of her fate. When the door to that shabby hospital room creaked open on the 4th day, it played out exactly as I had envisioned. I entered first, in my perfectly tailored navy suit, confident and cold. Behind me, my mother, Eleanor, sat in her wheelchair, draped in a cashmere shawl, her face a mask of undisguised glee. And beside me, holding my arm as if she had owned it for years, was Isabella. She wore a dress the color of fresh blood, a dramatic and cruel choice. She was the embodiment of everything Clara was not, wealthy, powerful, and utterly devoid of compassion. I walked to Clara's bedside. I didn't ask how she felt. I didn't look into her searching eyes. I simply tossed the manila envelope onto her chest. The heavy paper landed on the thin fabric of her hospital gown. "This is for you," I said. "No more honey. No more darling." My voice was that of a man speaking to a stranger, polite, but infinitely distant. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and pulled out the documents. A petition for divorce, filed with the court 3 days prior, on the very day she was on an operating table, sacrificing a part of her body for my family. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice as thin as a child's. "Why? I did everything you asked. Everything." It was then that my mother signaled the nurse to stop, turning the wheelchair so she had a clear view of Clara's face. She didn't want to miss a single emotion. "You did. You were useful for that, at least." My mother's voice was sharp as a scalpel, her gaunt face twisting into a sneer. "Did you really think my son married you for love? An orphan with nothing to her name, no money, no breeding, not even a family to ask where you'd gone if you disappeared." The monitor beside Clara's bed began to shriek frantically. The numbers on the screen danced, but I heard nothing but the roar in my own ears, the roar of a guilt I had tried so hard to ignore. "You were needed because you were a match, and because you had no one to ask questions, that's all," my mother continued, punctuating each word. "And we don't keep used things in a house like ours." Isabella stepped forward, a marble-sized diamond glittering on her finger. "My name is Isabella," she said with a smile that made even me, in that moment, feel a chill. "Isabella Thorne. Ethan and I have been together since college. While I was building my career in London, he found a temporary replacement with the right biological parameters." She placed a hand on her stomach, a simple gesture of devastating cruelty. "The future heir to the Vance legacy is right here. The legitimate heir everyone has been waiting for." I just nodded curtly, confirming her every word. The mask was completely off, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Isabella looked at Clara, at her pale, pain-racked face, at the tubes, at the divorce petition, and there wasn't a flicker of pity in her eyes. Only the supreme contempt for a naive girl who had been so easily duped. And I stood there, complicit in it all. I watched Clara's world crumble, and I thought I was safe. I thought I had won. I didn't know that this was just the quiet before the storm, and that storm was about to drown us all. Security arrived within a minute. There was no hesitation, no questions. Apparently the name Harrison Sterling carried more weight than any explanation I could offer. I tried to protest, to say Clara was my wife, that this was all a misunderstanding. But my words evaporated into the air. They escorted a struggling Ethan Vance from the room. They wheeled away a cursing Eleanor. Isabella followed, her heels clicking on the linoleum, the diamond on her hand seeming to have lost some of its sparkle. The door slammed shut, locking us out with our disgrace, and locking Clara in with her new, unexpected future. Clara's transfer to the executive suite on the top floor happened in less than an hour. I learned later, through my sources, of the stark contrast. A massive window with a panoramic view of the city, a leather sofa for guests, a private bathroom, a large screen on the wall. Marcus Whitaker, Harrison Sterling's chief of staff, a sharp man with observant grey eyes, informed her that all her medical and recovery expenses would be covered by the Sterling Foundation. "Why?" Clara had asked, tears streaming again, not from physical pain, but from the sheer weight of the juxtaposition. "To Mr. Sterling, your gift is a second chance to see the Georgia sunrise," Marcus had replied. "He always pays his debts. Always." While Clara was being wrapped in care and gratitude, my world began to fracture. The news that my mother's transplant had failed spread quickly through the elite circles. First whispers, then direct questions. My mother's medical expenses, even without the transplant, were astronomical. And now, with no hope for a full recovery, they became a financial black hole with no end in sight. At the same time, my relationship with Isabella began to fray. Her perfect plan had backfired. The temporary replacement she so despised was now under the patronage of one of the most powerful men in the country. This failure was a stain on her pride, and she took her frustration out on me. A week later, when Clara could sit up without a searing pain, she had another visitor. Thomas Reed, Sterling's head of legal, a man who looked like he'd won 1,000 cases and lost none. He didn't come to check on her health. He came with a purpose. He placed a folder on Clara's table. "Your husband made a mistake, Clara," Thomas had said quietly. "During your 2 years of marriage, he registered several assets in your name. A warehouse in Savannah, a stake in his textile mill, a commercial property in Midtown, even the house in Alpharetta. He was shielding his assets from creditors and the IRS. He was certain you would always be under his control." I had. It was a standard business strategy, a way to spread risk. I had used Clara's name as a shield, believing her naivety and dependence would guarantee my security. I had treated her as an asset, a legal instrument, nothing more. I never imagined that instrument could turn around and cut my own hands off. "Now," Thomas continued, "by filing for divorce with no claim on assets, he is legally relinquishing his rights to everything in your name. My advice? Sign the divorce papers quietly. Make no mention of the properties. Let the court's judgment become final." The man who considered himself so clever, who had called Clara a naive fool, had walked straight into a trap of his own arrogant making. When the news reached me through my own lawyer, I couldn't believe it. I tried to amend the divorce petition, but it was too late. The judgment was rendered. With a stroke of a pen, Clara, the woman from whom I had stripped everything, was now the legal owner of a significant portion of my wealth. Her meeting with Harrison Sterling took place 3 weeks later, on the hospital's rooftop garden. I heard the details of this fateful encounter later. Sterling, in his early 70s, still weak from surgery, radiated an unmistakable power. "So this is the girl," he had said, looking Clara up and down from under grey eyebrows. "The woman who gave a piece of herself to a demon, only for fate to divert the gift to me." He was direct. He told her he had researched her story, from the orphanage to the betrayal. He said he saw something in her that reminded him of his own granddaughter, who had died a decade earlier. "The money from Julian's estate is a start," Sterling continued. "But without the skills to manage it, it will vanish like smoke. This world is cruel, Clara. A good person without fangs gets eaten alive." He held out a wrinkled hand. "Let me be your mentor. Legally, we can arrange an adult adoption. It's just a name change on paper, but in practice, it's family. Come into my world, learn from me, and become a woman who can look at her ex-husband and see not a giant, but a pathetic insect." I can imagine that moment. I can imagine my mother's sneer, Isabella's smug smile, my own cold gaze. I can imagine all of it burning in Clara's mind, forging her resolve. If she went back into the world as just Clara Bell, I knew my family and I would find a way to crush her again. We couldn't have a charity case owning our assets. She took Harrison Sterling's hand. "Teach me," she had said. "Teach me how to destroy them." And Sterling had smiled, a wide, predatory grin in his eyes. The months that followed were a relentless transformation. While I was struggling with mounting medical bills, an increasingly distant Isabella, and a textile company on the verge of collapse, Clara was being forged. 5 a.m. was physical therapy. 7 a.m. was breakfast with Harrison Sterling, reading the Wall Street Journal. From 9 to 3, she had private tutors in management, corporate law, and public speaking. From 4 to 7, she sat in on real negotiations at Sterling's offices. She threw herself into her studies with the fury of someone with nothing left to lose. Her community college accounting background was a solid foundation. She just never had the chance to build on it. Every lesson was a brick in the wall of her new self. She learned to read financial statements, to understand market mechanics, to hold her own among powerful men. The external change mirrored the internal. Her hair was cut into a short, sharp bob. The baggy clothes were replaced with tailored power suits. But the real change was in her eyes. No more pleading for approval. No more fear of the abandoned orphan. Only the sharp, analytical gaze of a woman who knew her worth. She was no longer Clara Bell, the victim. She was becoming a force. A force created by my betrayal, funded by Sterling's gratitude, and fueled by a cold, controlled rage. And she was aiming it squarely at me. While Clara was tempering herself in the crucible of power and knowledge, my world was sinking into shadow. Reports from Thomas Reed, Sterling's lawyer, I would later learn, were delivered to her weekly, like a newsletter updating the decline of her enemy. Our divorce had been finalized 4 months prior. A judge signed off on it in a single session, asking no questions about the abrupt split. To the outside world, it was just another short, failed marriage. To me, it was a multi-million-dollar strategic blunder. At the same time, I was trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. I was planning an extravagant wedding with Isabella, a 500-guest gala, a designer gown from Milan, and rings from a jeweler who catered to Atlanta's elite. It was a desperate attempt to show that I was fine, that the Vance family was still a force to be reckoned with. I needed to show everyone that losing Clara and a few assets was nothing. But beneath the glittering surface, everything was rotting. My mother's health declined steadily. Dialysis 3 times a week, cardiac complications, mounting bills. Over $50,000 a month just to keep her stable. My funds were starting to hemorrhage. I began selling assets. The Porsche went first, then the G-Wagon. The flashy toys I once saw as symbols of my success were now just numbers on a balance sheet, sinking into the red. Rumors started to circulate in the business community. Vance Textiles was looking for a major investor to plug a massive cash flow hole. I was getting desperate, and a desperate man does foolish things. I can picture the scene. Clara standing by the window in Sterling's office, looking out at the lights of Atlanta stretching to the horizon. "Then we'll give him an investor," she had said, her voice holding none of the tremor of the girl I once knew. They created a shell corporation, Phoenix Investments. The irony was thick, a phoenix rising from my ashes. No obvious connection to the Sterling Corporation, registered in Delaware, a designated director, a ghost entity perfectly designed to arouse no suspicion from me. "What's the end game?" Thomas Reed had asked, pen poised. "Not to buy his company," Clara replied, and I can hear the ice in her voice through the second-hand accounts. "That's too quick, too merciful. No, we're going to put a golden noose around his neck. A noose he will gladly tighten himself, thinking it's a life raft." That noose arrived in the form of an invitation. A thick, gold-embossed envelope, delivered to my office by courier 2 weeks later. It was an invitation to an exclusive black-tie gala for investors of Sterling Development. The invitation hinted at a potential partnership with a promising textile manufacturer. I didn't question it. I didn't wonder why a giant like Sterling would suddenly be interested in my sinking business. I didn't check who was behind Phoenix Investments. I just saw the zeros on a potential check and calculated how many of my problems it could solve. Greed and desperation had clouded all my judgment. I took the bait. That evening, the top-floor restaurant of the Westin Peachtree Plaza was ablaze with light. Hundreds of lights reflected in crystal glasses and diamonds. I stood at the bar, adjusting my cufflinks, scanning the room for the investment fund's representative. Isabella stood beside me, looking stunning but on edge. She didn't like not being in control. Then Harrison Sterling stepped onto the small stage and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming across the room, "allow me to introduce the new CEO of Phoenix Investments, my associate, Ms. Amani Sterling." Amani? She had taken his name. A simple change on paper, but it was a declaration of power. I watched her descend the staircase. She wore an emerald green silk gown that set off her new, sharp beauty. A diamond necklace, which I later learned was a gift from Harrison to mark the completion of her training, glittered at her throat. This was not the pleading Clara Bell. This was Amani Sterling. And she looked like a queen. Her voice, when she spoke of seeking partners with clean reputations and transparent records, was steady and sure. The wine glass in Isabella's hand slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, drawing the eyes of everyone nearby. I stood frozen, forgetting to breathe. The woman we had left for dead in a public ward was now the head of the region's most powerful investment firm, the host of the evening, the center of every gaze. "No," Isabella whispered, grabbing my sleeve. "We have to get out of here. Now." "Wait," I said, shrugging her off. A crazy, desperate thought bloomed in my mind. She loved me once. Maybe she still does. This is our chance, don't you see? My arrogance, even in the face of undeniable truth, had not abated. I deluded myself into thinking I still held some power over her, but old love could be a trump card. I pushed through the crowd and called her name. "Amani!" She turned. Her face was a mask of blank politeness. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" Those words were colder than any scream or curse. It erased our 2 years, erased everything. "Amani," It's me, Ethan. Your husband? I stammered. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to recall a trivial fact. Ah, yes, Mr. Vance. I've read your file. My analysts prepared it. Declining revenue, overdue debt, a massive cash flow problem. It's fascinating. She looked at me, not as an ex-wife, but as an investor assessing a problematic asset. Come to my office on Monday. We'll discuss the possibilities. She paused, then added a final killing sentence, a final twist of the knife. But be warned, it's strictly business, no personal topics. That night, I went home not with an investment deal, but with a cold sense of dread. The prey I had hunted had now become the hunter, and I realized I had been invited to this party not as a guest, but as the main course. That Monday, I walked into the Sterling Tower with a sense of dread mixed with foolish hope. I was still clinging to the idea that maybe this was a test, that Amani was giving me a chance to redeem myself in her own way. The Phoenix Investments office took up an entire floor, with a panoramic view of the city. Everything was sleek, modern, and smelled of money and power. I was shown into a long mahogany boardroom, where Amani was already seated at the head of the table. She looked distant and professional in a charcoal grey suit. She was flanked by an army of lawyers and analysts, men with grim faces, who looked like they were about to dissect a corpse, not a financial report. I sat at the other end of the table, feeling small and out of my depth. What followed was a massacre. They systematically tore apart the financial statement I had creatively enhanced. The numbers didn't match the bank records. The suppliers I listed didn't exist. The revenues had been blatantly inflated. Every one of my lies was exposed with cold, undeniable facts. I sat there, sweat beading on my forehead, as my paper empire crumbled before my eyes. After her analysts were finished, Amani let the silence hang in the room for a long, heavy moment. I was prepared to be thrown out in disgrace. But instead, she said, "Despite all this, we are still prepared to invest $2 million. I looked up, unable to believe my ears. Hope, that stubborn weed, began to sprout again. Maybe she did still care. Maybe this was her way of saving me. It's a convertible loan, she continued, and each subsequent word was another link in the noose she was placing around my neck. Secured against the entirety of the company's shares and the borrower's personal assets. She paused, looking me directly in the eye. If revenue targets are not met within 3 months, everything transfers to Phoenix Investments. Surely a professional like yourself, Mr. Vance, is confident in his own abilities. It was a challenge, wrapped in a tempting offer. She was playing on my pride, and I swallowed the bait whole. $2 million would solve all my immediate problems. My mother's medical bills, the supplier debts, and, most importantly, it would allow me to throw the lavish wedding to Isabella and save face. 3 months. I thought I could fake the reports for 3 months. I was too desperate to see the obvious trap. I signed the contract without a second thought. After I left, Thomas Reed couldn't hide his grin. He just took a loan secured by assets that, by court order, belong to you, Amani, he said. The Savannah warehouse, the Midtown property, the Alpharetta house. Attempting to pledge someone else's property as collateral is bank fraud. That's a federal offense. 10 to 20 years. I had no idea. I was still under the delusion that I could contest the ownership of those properties later. I hadn't realized that my signature on the divorce papers was final. And the targets we set, Amani added, they're impossible. We've already choked off his main distribution channels by pressuring his key clients. The trap was perfectly laid. I had walked into it myself, led by greed and desperation. While I was busy celebrating my victory, Amani turned her attention to Isabella. A dossier on my mistress was delivered to her a week later. Photos, bank statements, medical records. Isabella at romantic dinners with a man named Trey, a local club owner with a criminal record. Regular wire transfers from my company accounts to Trey's, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And most damningly, the pregnancy timeline. Isabella was 20 weeks pregnant. Amani only needed to do simple math. Conception had occurred 4.5 months ago. During that week, I had been in New York for a textile trade show for 7 straight days. Security footage from an Atlanta hotel captured Isabella and Trey entering and leaving a room daily during that same period. The child wasn't mine. Isabella had been planning to drain me of my money and run off with her lover as soon as she had a large enough sum. The $2 million investment from Phoenix was exactly what she had been waiting for. Buoyed by the new contract, I did something even more foolish. I asked Amani to dinner to celebrate the partnership. I chose a restaurant in a historic old mansion. Candles, white tablecloths, live music. I turned on the charm full blast, confessing my regrets like a man tortured by his conscience. My mother pressured me. You have to understand. She's always been so controlling. I lied smoothly. And Isabella, she was a mistake, a burden I'm ready to cast off. I always loved you, Amani. I'm ready to leave her tomorrow. Put my mother in a state-run home. Anything to have you back. I had no idea the digital recorder in her purse was capturing every word, every inflection, every betrayal. I was handing her the weapon to destroy my mother myself. I'll think about it, she said, standing and draping her coat over her shoulders. Enjoy your dinner, Ethan. It might be the last one at this level you'll have. She left, leaving me alone with my wine and the delusion that I was slowly regaining control. I didn't realize I was only tightening the noose around my own neck. I wasn't just losing the company. I was losing everything. And the woman orchestrating it all, the woman I had despised and discarded, was watching from a distance, with terrifying calm, waiting for the final moment to pull the rope. The 3 months passed in a hazy dream. I lived in a fantasy world, funded by $2 million of borrowed money. I paid my mother's medical bills, put down a deposit on a lavish wedding venue, and lavished money on Isabella to keep her happy, completely unaware she was siphoning a large portion of it to her lover. I instructed my accountant to create fraudulent sales reports, beautiful, imaginary numbers that showed 200% growth. I believed I could outsmart Amani and Phoenix Investments, that I could buy enough time to figure out a real escape. Judgment Day came in the middle of March. The team from Phoenix Investments, led by Thomas Reed, arrived at my office. But this time, they weren't alone. They were accompanied by federal agents. I was sitting at my desk, confident in my latest fake report, ready for a progress meeting. But there was no meeting. There was a surprise audit. They unraveled it all in a matter of hours. The empty warehouses, the idle machinery, the phantom contracts. The truth was stark and undeniable. The FBI is in the lobby, Thomas Reed said coolly, as his team collected documents. Bank fraud, wire fraud. You're looking at a very long time, Mr. Vance. My entire world collapsed in that moment. Prison. Years behind bars. The only thought in my head was to get to my mother. I had to say goodbye before it was all over. I panicked. I bolted out a back emergency exit, jumped in my car, and sped to the hospital, not knowing I was racing directly into the final act of Amani's play. When I burst into my mother's hospital room, the scene before me was paralyzing. Isabella was there, but she wasn't comforting my mother. She was frantically stuffing my gold watches and cufflinks into her designer handbag. What are you doing?" I gasped, unable to believe my eyes. "Get out of here, you fool," she hissed, making no attempts to hide her contempt. "Before the feds get here, I'm not going down with this ship." Just then, the door opened and Amani walked in. She was dressed in a white suit, looking as calm and cold as a Georgia winter. She said nothing, just dropped a folder on the floor. Photographs scattered. Isabella with tray, bank transaction statements, medical records. I snatched up the photos, my hands shaking. My face went purple with rage and humiliation. The baby wasn't mine. The entire future I had used to justify my actions, the Vance heir, was a lie. "Blood type O," Amani said, her voice even, devoid of emotion. "You're type A. Isabella is type B. It's basic genetics, Ethan. High school biology." A blind rage took me. I lunged forward and slapped Isabella across the face, so hard she flew against the wall. She screamed, vile words pouring out of her like venom. "You're a failure. Your mother is a dried-up husk. I hate you both. I always have." In the midst of the chaos, Amani pulled out her phone. And then, my own voice filled the room. The recording from our dinner. "Isabella is a burden. The baby was a mistake. I'll put my mother in a home. She's a nuisance with her illnesses." My mother, Eleanor, heard every word. Her son, planning to discard her like a piece of old furniture. My mother gasped, reaching a bony hand toward Amani, clawing at the air. "Save me, daughter, please." It was the first and last time she would ever call her that. Amani walked to the bed, looked down at that hand, the same hand that had waved her away in contempt while calling her a charity case. "My kidney was a gift of love," Amani said, her voice cold but clear. "I would have given it gladly for the mother I lost when I was 9. You are not my mother, Eleanor. You are the woman who ordered her son to divorce me while I was in intensive care, bleeding and wondering if I was going to survive." The heart monitor flatlined, a long, high-pitched tone. Eleanor Vance's heart hadn't just failed from renal disease. It had been broken by the betrayal of the only thing she truly loved. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing amidst the wreckage. Amani turned and walked out of the room, never once looking back. She had done her work. She hadn't killed my mother with a knife or a gun. She had killed her with the truth. The truth I had so willingly provided. I had not only dug the grave for my career, I had dug one for my mother. And Amani, the calm executioner, had simply stood aside and let me shovel the dirt on myself. The arrest came 2 days later at my mother's funeral. The service was pathetic. A few distant relatives, the funeral home staff, and a couple of curious reporters who smelled scandal more than they came to mourn. The news of the bankruptcy and the criminal case had made the Vance name a plague. Old friends avoided my gaze. Business partners didn't return my calls. I stood there, by the freshly dug grave, feeling more alone than ever, a solitude I had once exploited in Clara to destroy her. Isabella had been arrested at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, trying to board a flight to Dubai with a suitcase full of cash. Her betrayal was a final, bass note in the symphony of my collapse. But by then, I felt almost nothing. I was numb. As the casket was being lowered into the damp, red Georgia clay, 2 plainclothes agents approached me. The click of the handcuffs was sharp and loud next to the open grave. They were leading me to an unmarked car when I noticed a black Mercedes parked on the small cemetery road. The tinted window lowered a few inches. There, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast day, was Amani. She didn't look at me with triumph. She didn't look at me with contempt. She looked at me with nothing at all, like viewing a finished painting, reading a closed chapter. That gaze was worse than hate. It was indifference. It said I no longer mattered, that I was a footnote in her past, a lesson learned, a debt paid. The window slid silently up. The car pulled away and disappeared around the bend. It was the last time I ever saw her. A year later, in the quiet of my cell, I received a letter. Not from my lawyer, not from any remaining family. It was from a charitable foundation I had never heard of. There was no note inside, just a newspaper clipping from a local journal. The photo showed Amani Sterling standing in front of a new wing of a hospital in Monroe, Georgia. The headline read, "Sterling Bell Foundation funds new renal care center." Sterling Bell. She had merged her new name with her old one, an acknowledgement of who she was and who she had become. The article described how she had stood in a small Monroe cemetery before two modest grey granite headstones, her parents' graves. She had talked to them, told them how her life had turned out, how she was now helping others in similar situations, paying medical bills for those who couldn't afford them, hiring lawyers for those who had been deceived. The scar on her left flank, the article noted, had faded to a thin, pale line. "I used to hate it," Amani was quoted as saying. "I saw it as a symbol of my own naivety. Now I see it as a medal, proof that I walked through hell, hit the bottom, and climbed my way back out, stronger and wiser." There was another photo in the article. Amani walking with a man. I recognized him immediately. Dr. Bennett. They weren't in business attire. He was in jeans and a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up. They were laughing, a warm, genuine laugh. The article ended with a romantic flourish, hinting at a budding relationship between the doctor who had pulled her from despair and the woman who had become a symbol of resilience. I sat in my cell, staring at that article for hours. I looked at the woman I had tried to break, who was now rebuilding worlds, not just for herself, but for others. She had turned her pain into purpose. She had turned my betrayal into a source of strength. I had tried to destroy her by taking away her family. But in the end, I was the one who lost everything. I lost my mother, my mistress, my company, my freedom. I ended up in a cell, haunted by the ghosts of what I had done. And Clara, or Amani, she had found a new family, a foster father, a mentor, and perhaps a true love. She had found the belonging she so craved, not by sacrificing a piece of her body, but by building it from the strength of her own soul. I had thought our story was about revenge, but I was wrong. Revenge was just the vehicle. The real story was about rebirth. She was reborn from the ashes I created, and I was left to rot in them. A permanent reminder that true evil lies not in sophisticated schemes, but in the rot of a heart that chooses cruelty over love. And that is a sentence I will serve for the rest of my life. The sun will set, leaving the world in darkness. But tomorrow it will surely rise again. And so will she. That last line of the article haunted me. A simple verse that encapsulated a whole philosophy. For Amani, every day was a new dawn, a chance to build, to heal, to become stronger. For me, every day was just a repeat of the same sunset, a sinking deeper into the darkness of regret. I don't know who sent me that article. Perhaps it was Amani herself, not as a final act of vengeance, but as an act of closure, a way of showing me the final outcome of the choices we had both made. She had chosen life. I had chosen destruction, and in the end, destroyed myself. Or perhaps it was someone from her foundation, a random act of kindness, with no idea the recipient was the man who had created their founder. I prefer to believe the latter. It makes the irony all the more bitter. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wonder what would have happened if I had chosen a different path. What if, The moment I saw that hunger in Clara's eyes in that boutique, I had chosen to love instead of to use. What if I had faced my mother's illness with cowardice? We could have had a different life. A life perhaps less glamorous, but real. A life filled with the laughter of children we would never have, in the house that now belongs to her. But what-ifs are a form of torture for the condemned. They offer no comfort, only deepen the wound. The truth is, I was who I was. A selfish, arrogant man, raised in an environment that believed money and power could buy anything, including human body parts. I was taught to see people like Clara as pawns on my chessboard, not as human beings with dreams and pain. And now, I am paying the price. Not just with my years of freedom. I pay it with every memory of her trusting smile, every recollection of the feel of her hand in mine, every time I close my eyes and see her face behind the glass of the operating room door. That is my true prison. One without bars, but also without escape. My story has no redemption. I do not write these words to seek forgiveness, not from anyone, and least of all from myself. I write them as a warning, a map of the road to hell, paved with selfish intentions and polished lies. I write them because in this endless silence, telling the story is the only thing left. To acknowledge the truth of the monster I became. I began this story by talking about the sound of a heart monitor. But there is another sound that haunts me. It is the silence. The silence in the hospital room after Amani had security called. The silence in the courtroom when the judge passed sentence. The silence of a phone that never rings. The silence of a life stripped of all meaning. This story is my attempt to fill that silence. And so, I want to end with a thank you. No, not to those who have listened to the confession of a sinner. This thank you is for her, the woman I called Clara, and the world now knows as Amani. Thank you, Amani. Not for forgiving me. I know you never will, and I don't deserve it. But thank you for surviving. Thank you for not letting my evil define you. Thank you for turning the scar I gave you into a symbol of strength. Thank you for showing the world that even after the most devastating storm, the sun can rise again, brighter and more powerful than ever. By living a good life, you have passed the final and most just sentence upon me. You have shown me everything I could have had, and everything I threw away. And that is a sentence I will carry with me forever in the silence. A word of thanks to those who listened. I am grateful for the opportunity to have shared